Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and to our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome all those who join us on these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to check that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. It will be appreciated. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments via email, simply sending them to speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post the program within 24 hours on our website for everyone's future reference. Hosting our discussion today is John Von Cannon, Vice President and Senior Counsel. John has been a key player in Heritage's phenomenal growth in financial strength, membership numbers, and influence for more than 30 years. Baron Von Cannon joined Heritage in 1980 as an assistant to then-President Edwin J. Fulner for fundraising activities. But for the majority of his career here, he headed Heritage's Development Department as Vice President and Treasurer. In 2009, he assumed his current position and now concentrates on strategic planning, messaging to members, mentoring members of our development team, and public speaking. In his pre-Heritage years, the Baron was publisher of The American Spectator. He also serves as a trustee of FREE, the Foundation for Research on the Economics of the Environment in Bozeman, Montana, and he is a trustee of 4 grant-making institutions. So please join me in welcoming John Von Cannon. John.
Thank you, John. Transparency in philanthropy is an increasingly important topic, and in fact, if you Google it, you get 1.1 million matches. Not bad. But then it doesn't come close to the 313 million Google matches for Harlem Shake. So the panelists, you have a major challenge. Most importantly, the topic is of interest to you, both those here in the room and those watching online. So thank you all for joining us today. And special thanks to the Philanthropy Roundtable for putting this together. I think most of you know the Roundtable, but if you don't, it's a terrific organization headed by a real entrepreneur, Adam Meyerson, who's been a colleague and friend of mine and of Heritage for many years. The mission of the Philanthropy Roundtable has 5 parts. Philanthropic freedom is essential to a free society. A vibrant private sector generates the wealth that makes philanthropy possible. Voluntary private action often offers solutions for many of society's most pressing challenges. Excellence in philanthropy is measured by results, not good intentions, and a respect for donor intent is essential for philanthropic integrity. The whole idea of philanthropy was started in the ancient Jews, and in the Talmud it appears building on the biblical obligation to help the poor, widows, and others in need. Unlike charity, this concept means justice and righteousness, and it's something that God commands us to do. There's no praise associated with doing it, only contempt for not. So to brag about giving would be like bragging that you're taking care of a sick child or that you work for a living. A related notion is that you help people discreetly, preferably anonymously, both to avoid the recipient losing dignity and because to do it publicly would be to raise suspicion that you are giving in order to be praised. This Jewish concept continues in the New Testament where Jesus teaches, "So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others." Today, of course, we've come full circle, and we, at least private foundations, are required to announce their giving, not exactly with trumpets, but at least on page 11, part 15, lines 3A and B on IRS Form 990 PF. And it's all available to anyone. Passwords are not required. Some say this isn't enough. We need more. Transparency is a virtue, and someone needs to make sure that you're spending your money the right way. So the debate is underway, and that's why the Philanthropy Roundtable and the Heritage Foundation joined forces to bring you this discussion. To start off, we'll hear from John Tyler, a longtime philanthropic leader. John is General Counsel, Secretary, and Chief Ethics Officer of the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City. He's also a leader in the Philanthropy Roundtable, the Alliance for Charitable Reform, the Philanthropic Collaborative, Urban Entrepreneur Partnership, and many other nonprofit organizations. In addition to this monograph on transparency that we'll discuss today, he's also co-authored another roundtable monograph entitled How Public is Private Philanthropy? Separating Reality from Myth. John?
Thank you, John, and thank you also to the Heritage Foundation for hosting this event today, and my thanks to the roundtable, to Allison, Joanne, Adam Meyerson, Susie Garment, who's the editor on both of those monographs, Sue Santa, who was involved with helping put the monographs together, and also to the Cyril Freedom Trust, who provided funding for both monographs to cover distribution and publication costs. Appreciate your all being here as well, and your interest in the topic of philanthropy, and more specifically, the concept of transparency in philanthropy. And as you think about the concept of transparency in philanthropy, it for me generates a few different notions. Most often, the topic comes up very generally. We need more transparency in philanthropy. Transparency is a good thing. Foundations should be more transparent. And along those same lines, you can drill down a little bit, and very recently, in the last few years, the Foundation Center introduced its Glass Pockets initiative with an eye towards enhancing transparency in philanthropy. You can go back a little bit further. AB 624 that was introduced in the California legislature was introduced in part and pursued in part in the name of transparency. More recently, we're seeing bills introduced in state legislatures, not necessarily focused on foundations, but looking at philanthropy more broadly and charities more broadly. There are some bills that have been introduced in some states to subject 501c3 organizations to state open records laws, state open meetings laws, as if they are governmental agencies or quasi-governmental agencies. There are different variations of the state legislation, but clearly this is an interest in forcing transparency. But a lot of times when you look at the conversations around transparency, they lack clarity, they lack discipline, they lack definition. For instance, it's not clear, except maybe as I mentioned with AB 624 and with some of the state legislation, it's not clear when people, too often when people are talking about transparency in philanthropy, do they mean voluntary transparency? Are they trying to encourage foundations to be more transparent? We'll get to what does that mean in a second. Or are they advocating for mandated transparency, for changes in law, regulation, and policy to force more openness, to force more disclosures? And that lack of clarity creates problems for the conversation around transparency. And to the extent that they're looking to force transparency, it's not clear what the authority is that they're relying on to force greater transparency. Is it the law? If so, we've got a tax code that folks primarily get to, and that has its own opportunities and limitations. But a lot of times what you hear with forced transparency, a lot of times what I've heard is we need more transparency in philanthropy because after all, government is transparent. Okay, part of the point made. We need more transparency in philanthropy because business is transparent. But each of those, and there is transparency in government, maybe should be more in certain ways, so I'm not going to get into that. But there are degrees of transparency in government, and that's part of my point. Government shouldn't be wholly transparent. There should be certain things that happen behind closed doors, even in government, and it does. Even sunshine laws, open records, open meetings laws have exceptions for certain things. So a reference to government as transparent doesn't carry much weight because that transparency is in furtherance of other things, in furtherance of an informed electorate, in furtherance of holding elected officials and policymakers accountable to the electorate. So transparency is not its own independent value. It's not its own independent virtue by way of relying on government to say, well, government's transparent, therefore philanthropy should be transparent. When sometimes folks look at business, they say, well, business is transparent. Well, there are degrees of transparency in business, and business isn't fully transparent either. And even the transparency in business is in furtherance of some other objective, not transparency in and of itself. So business transparency, and by the way, there's a huge difference between publicly traded companies and privately held companies. There's greater transparency required of publicly traded companies for specific reasons. The marketplace depends on the flow of information. A fair marketplace, particularly with regard to publicly traded companies, depends on a fair, even ability to access information. And that's part of ensuring the efficiency of the markets as much as possible. Can you get my mother? Oh, sure. Thank you. And other purposes that serve our economic systems. But it's not transparency for its own sake. And too often, I've heard folks say in the context of philanthropy, that if you are not a transparent foundation, you must be hiding something. What are you trying to hide? What sort of fraud do you have going on at your place? And that assumption just doesn't follow. It doesn't make sense, and it's unfairly disparaging of the good work of foundations and folks who work in foundations. So transparency is not its own independent virtue. It's not its own independent value. Instead, transparency, to the right degrees and with the right limits and the right opportunities with them, are in furtherance of other ends, of other values. And too often, that important distinction gets lost in discussions of transparency and philanthropy. That's one point where there's lack of clarity. Another is, well, what do you mean by transparency? Disclosure, openness, well, what do you mean? Access to what? Access to standards, access to missions, access to strategies, or access to decision-making meetings, records of those meetings, why particular strategies were adopted or rejected, why a particular grant was made or not made, much to the potential chagrin or embarrassment of grantees, or I guess without regard to the potential devastating effect that kind of transparency can have on grantees, not to mention the types of effects that it can have on decision-making in these fundamentally private enterprises. Foundations are not government. Foundations are private. So transparency to what end? That's often neglected. Transparency about what, or meaning what, or with regard to what. That's another point where there's too much ambiguity, or lack of discipline. A third frequently neglected characteristic of transparency is the question, well, transparency at what cost? Transparency costs money. You hire people, engage systems, undertake activities that cost money to engage in transparency, whether voluntary or whether mandated. The tax return, which John mentioned, it costs money and time to prepare the tax return. And I'm not saying that that's good or bad. It's just an acknowledgement that transparency can be expensive, or can be costly at least. That can also distract people from other work that they do. So it takes time. And there's an opportunity cost associated with that money and with that time. What else could the money be used for? What else could that time be used for? And I'm not specifically talking about the tax return. The tax return, we have to do, and it needs to be done. But transparency writ large, too often these sorts of costs and the need to balance the costs, even if there is some benefit to be gained from mandating greater transparency, I'm not convinced there is, but even if there is, at what cost? And so often we hear foundations being criticized because of their administrative expenses, because of what they spend to actually operate. Well, if you're advocating for more mandated transparency, you're also advocating for increasing administrative costs and increasing operating costs. And that then correlates quite often to decreased giving, or decreased funds going to charities and to charitable activities. But there are other costs as well. These are sort of the costs you can count, time and money. But what about the costs that need to be balanced? What about the costs to the principles that foundations and the philanthropic sector represent and stand for? The flexibility that foundations have, the diversity of foundations and their missions and their types and sizes. What about their ability to take the long view and to provide patient capital? What about their ability to take risks? What about their ability to be contrarian, to be unpopular, to go against the crowd, or even to pursue things that nobody has thought of? You've heard a lot about white lines on the sides of highways in recent years. Nobody was thinking about that. You look at any number of philanthropic endeavors that involved risk or involved not necessarily doing the popular things. What cost does transparency have on the principles of philanthropy and what philanthropy represents, not only in those ways, but in ways associated with constitutional guarantees like free speech, like freedom of assembly? Philanthropy is very much an expression of these things, and very much, I contend, an expression of the blessings of liberty, which is a core to the United States. And not only are there costs to the foundation, but there are costs to those that the foundations work with, the grantees. If you want more transparency in foundations, foundations do their work through their grantees. Where are foundations going to go to get the data and information to be more transparent? They're going to impose burdens on grantees. That's a cost. We're now distracting grantees from the things that they do, and probably time that could be better, that they could better spend delivering their services. But these things don't generally get talked about in the context of philanthropy. There's transparency in philanthropy. Too often there's the overarching glow of transparency without necessarily the discipline to drill down and what are we talking about. So, I contend that asking questions around these issues, around these topics, well, what do you mean by transparency? What are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to achieve, a better sense of the place of foundations within our economic system? So there's data to be collected about employment information or things like that. Or are you trying to achieve the redistribution of wealth and the imposition of quotas and ratios on board memberships and grantee organizations? They're two very different purposes, and if the ends, the desired ends, aren't necessarily clear, we don't know how to have the dialogue. And that means that there is, I think, an appropriate skepticism about general calls for transparency. But there are some more specific calls for transparency. Transparency in furtherance of accountability. Transparency in furtherance of effectiveness. And each of these, so they're eliminating some of the ambiguity. But accountability and effectiveness are not the same. And transparency in furtherance of them is not the same, particularly if you're looking at mandatory transparency. So let's consider accountability. Accountability means there is a responsibility, you're held accountable to comply with something, to achieve certain, or to achieve certain deliverables. So you're being held accountable, and very often that means there are consequences for failing to live up to that accountability. So in the context of accountability, we actually do have transparency in philanthropy now in furtherance of accountability. And that accountability is to the law, primarily to the tax code. When you think about that accountability, which is real and which does exist, and the public disclosures of the 990 PF is a part of fulfilling that accountability. The compliance with the tax code, and the first two of these apply even beyond the tax code, involve being organized and operated in furtherance of charitable purposes as defined by the code. So it's not just charity, it's education, it's health, it's arts and culture and all the things that we know about. It's no private benefit. For foundations, severe restrictions on lobbying, no engagement in political activity, and then making public certain documents, including the tax return. Notice what it's not. These are requirements. They are mandates imposed on foundations and 501c3 organizations more generally. They require certain behaviors. They don't actually empower the government to do anything but enforce consistency and compliance with these behaviors, which is appropriate. But too often the accountability term comes up. We need to hold foundations accountable to the tax code. Well, that means, are we operating with charitable purposes and no public or no private benefit, et cetera? It doesn't mean that government has the right to impose quotas or or ratios, on giving or other things. So there's mandates for accountability. There's enforcement with regard to those mandates, but it's not empowering government. And too often the conversations about accountability assume that there is some vested power in government to impose certain standards. Now, if you notice too on the requirement, the second requirement is no private benefit, and that's a shorthand for what's really at play there. No private benefit is not the same as mandatory public purposes. The public purposes side of what foundations do is encompassed in the first requirement, which is operating in furtherance of charitable purposes, which is a narrower subset of public benefit. But it's charitable purposes. So imposing a public benefit or using public benefit to impose standards for transparency doesn't originate in you can't have private benefit. The opposite of no private benefit is not yes public benefit, public purposes. They're two different things. Accountability or transparency and furtherance of accountability also comes up sometimes in the quid pro quo context. There's a thinking that, well, the government is allowing tax exemption, the government is allowing tax deductibility. What economic benefit are we deriving in return for that benefit? And as a policy question, it's not an unfair question for policymakers to ask. Policymakers must be responsible with whether it's tax policy or direct expenditure of funds. So asking the question, what are we getting in return, is not necessarily a bad question to ask. It depends on what you're doing with the question and what you're trying to accomplish with the question. Are you trying to make an assessment of tax policy, or are you trying to undertake mandates for the specific activities of the 501c3 organizations, including mandating greater transparency than is otherwise allowed by law or required by law? But the quid pro quo argument doesn't necessarily fly, because when you look at the tax favored treatment, that's only part of the donations, and it's a relatively small part of the donations. So what about the rest of the money, which is most of the money? Why does the government have the right to impose transparency based on what is the overwhelming majority of funds that go to foundations? So there's an economic fallacy in the quid pro quo argument, and there are other economic fallacies related to that as well. And not only that, the quid pro quo argument neglects the important non-monetary contributions of the sector. the non-monetary contributions that I mentioned a few minutes ago. It's as if the only thing that matters is the economic contributions of the sector. And the sector is an economic engine, there's no question about it, but the sector doesn't necessarily exist and didn't come about because it's an economic contributor. It came about because it's an expression of and fulfillment of non-monetary aspects of our society. Sometimes the concept of accountability, not only to the law, to quid pro quo, but accountability to stakeholders comes up. And there are some difficulties with the stakeholder argument. One of them is, well, what do you mean and why? What do you mean by accountability to stakeholders? Are you looking to impose, are you looking to invest rights in stakeholders so they have enforcement power? Are you looking to impose duties or responsibilities on directors and management with regard to stakeholders? And with what consequences for failing to live up to those duties and responsibilities? So note how stakeholder theory, and actually it's borrowed from business, and if you look at stakeholder theory in business, it's a management theory that business should engage with its stakeholders to be more efficient, more effective, and offer better goods and services as it relates to things that customers want to buy, things that suppliers are willing to engage, to contribute, creditors and and financial capital. It's to engage stakeholders so that the organization operates better, essentially. Stakeholder theory too often as it relates to philanthropy is either unclear about what do you mean vested rights, enforcement powers, fiduciary duties to stakeholders, or do you mean as a management tool? And by the way, I think as a management tool, engaging grantees, prospective grantees, the people they serve, the communities we operate in, I think engaging what might be considered stakeholders is good for foundations. We can make better decisions. We can learn more. We can help facilitate collaborations and contribute to efficiency in what grantees do and in how our missions and our objectives are accomplished. So engaging those folks is an important tool for foundations to operate successfully. That's different from abdicating responsibilities to stakeholders or vesting enforcement power or rights in stakeholders. That takes stakeholder theory to a whole different place that it doesn't exist in the business world. Now, in the business world with hybrid forms, there's some movement to permit some of that vesting of authority, but it's, when you look at it, it's not really vesting in authority because the only enforcement mechanisms in the business world for those stakeholders is by the shareholders. If in the hybrid forms you choose to prioritize employees, that doesn't give employees rights against the directors if they don't do that. Shareholders still have those rights. So, with regard to accountability, it's important to figure out, are you talking mandatory or are you talking voluntary? And if mandatory, to what? To the law and charitable purposes, no private benefit, etc., or to something else, to economic contributions, which doesn't actually exist in the law, to stakeholders, which doesn't actually exist in law. What accountability to what is a very important question. And, accountability is sometimes confused with effectiveness. Then you get into effectiveness. Well, effectiveness is, have you achieved certain goals? Not deliverables, not compliance, but goals. Have you been effective in achieving your outcomes? But based on what? And who gets to decide? What standards? What goals? Who gets to decide? Who gets to assess whether or not the goals have been achieved? Is this a role for government? I mean, government doesn't assess its own effectiveness well, much less turning out to the charitable sector and the philanthropic sector. And not only that, whether it's government, whether it's a private umbrella organization of some sort, beware of what effectiveness can do by way of politicization and entrenched interests protecting and preserving themselves. The charitable sector, the philanthropic sector, is not necessarily about entrenched interests. It is about fulfilling donor intent, and it is about having the freedom and flexibility to do those things that contribute most and best to our society within what we can. If you're looking at effectiveness, and by the way, foundations should look at their effectiveness. They should ask questions about their effectiveness, and they should engage in those discussions. But should there be a mandate and then the standards that come with that? By the way, if you're going to judge effectiveness, well, what consequences for failure? And now suddenly you have accountability. And if you're going to have consequences for failure, what consequences? Who gets to decide those? Who gets to decide whether there's enough compliance that the consequences can be preserved or prevented? Who pays the consequences? The organization, the managers, individuals? There's a lot of ambiguity even around mandated approaches to effectiveness. And again, if you're going to look at foundation effectiveness, foundations are going to look to their grantees and impose duties and responsibilities on their grantees. And not only that, there's some arguments that the 1969 Act resulted in safer grant making, greater deference to lawyers and accountants as opposed to people who know philanthropy, preferences for the popular. So if you're looking at effectiveness, are we actually potentially undermining those intangible values and principles that the sector represents? Now, all of that being said, I am a big proponent of voluntarily undertaken and pursued transparency. I think that it serves foundations, it serves grantees, I think it serves the sector. When foundations look at for themselves, what does transparency mean to us? What can we do to be more transparent, and in being more transparent, facilitate how we achieve our objectives, our missions, our charitable purposes, and at what cost? And is the cost justified? Monetary, time, principles, etc. And foundation boards really are in the best position to do that specific balancing. Foundation management is in the best position to do that sort of balancing. But I think that it's important for foundations to undertake it because there can be gains. Your processes can be engaged in more efficiently. You might have fewer people looking for money that are irrelevant to what you do. You might have more people looking for money that are directly relevant to what you do. You might have opportunities to put together collaborations, to leverage your own dollars, knowing that there are other funders out there looking at some of the same things, some of the same projects that you're looking at. And transparency can help connect those networks and tie those, connect those dots and tie those networks. At the same time, it's important that foundations, if they're going to undertake a transparency analysis, you do it in your context, you do it on your terms. There are different health, frankly, or physical risks that foundations have. Certain foundations that operate in certain parts of the world have to worry about the safety, the physical safety of their employees. Donors have to worry about their physical safety sometimes. They have to worry about being deluged with requests. And not only that, there are a lot of donors that actually are, for religious reasons, they don't want to engage in transparency beyond what they have to comply with the law. And they may not even want to do that, but they do it anyway. And John mentioned some of those with the Jewish religion, but also, and John quoted from the New Testament as well, but Islam also has tenets of privacy around giving. And those religious motivations should not be understood or should not be understated and need to be understood and respected. Now, as you think about these different things I've talked about them in the context of transparency. But a lot of times, accountability, effectiveness, the role of philanthropy. These are things that happen outside the context of transparency as well. And sometimes some of the same questions I've asked, some of the same processes I've gone through, evaluations I've gone through in the monograph, apply whether accountability is limited to transparency and furtherance of accountability, or accountability or effectiveness for itself. And so the monograph itself has potentially broader applications than transparency. Again, I want to thank the Heritage Foundation for the chance to talk and for its rolling out of the monograph. And thank Rick and Heather for being willing to comment. Rick and I, by the way, this is, I think, our third or fourth panel we've been on together with transparency, and he always adds something new every time, so I'm looking forward to that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. After nearly 8 years as Executive Director of the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, Rick Cohen joined the Nonprofit Quarterly as its national correspondent, where he has served since 2006. He has wide experience in both government and nonprofit organizations and has appeared on a wide range of radio and television programs, including both the CBS and ABC Evening News, BBC, Fox News, CNN, and National Public Radio. Rick Cohen.
That was a great introduction to the topic, for sure. John's material is excellent. I mean, this monograph, the previous monograph on accountability, even where we have different perspectives or come at it from different angles, really excellent material and very thought-provoking. Since I'm generally the liberal pinata on...
I didn't mention where you
let me actually reference... Maggie Thatcher died a couple of days ago, and there was a wonderful op-ed by Paul Johnson, the great historian, in the Wall Street Journal talking about her life, and people think of Maggie Thatcher as this ideologue that basically just hammered an ideology through to its end. And yet the reality was she was a pragmatist. She said, how do I get things done? How do I achieve what has to be done in a way of making it happen, as opposed to basically hammering an ideological line. Plus, she was a risk taker. I mean, her strategies, even within her own party, which got her bounced from her party, by the way, at the end, were risk-oriented. And of course, when John talks about foundations taking risk, I wish that were really true, that foundations were really taking risks. So many of them have a definition of risk that would be hard for me to grasp. But I understand the challenges and the complexities of philanthropic transparency that John has laid out in his writings. I mean, they're very thoughtful and stimulating. It's possible to argue against many efforts that build out transparency due to the kind of complex problems that John identified, ranging from just the simple mechanics to time and cost to issues in terms of what might be overdoing the purpose of transparency without having a purpose in mind that you're trying to solve. Nonetheless, as an ethic or predisposition, particularly in today's political environment, I think foundations, and I have a feeling that your conclusion sort of said the same, foundations should be aiming for ways for increasing their transparency, not reducing it, and to find practical ways of doing so, rather than falling to a default proposition that no change or no increases in transparency are better than doing something. I would suggest one more proposition before I launch into my take on these issues, which is that I don't think this is a debate about legislative or regulatory changes, despite the fact that obviously some people will try to put different perspectives in that box and embalm it. While there's a battle probably to be had on Capitol Hill regarding many things that people here are interested in, the congressional, the travel deduction and other things, though I doubt there's ever going to be any change in that, there's not a scintilla of appetite in Congress for new legislation or regulations that will tighten oversight of foundations. There's probably even less of an appetite in the tax-exempt unit of the Internal Revenue Service, which has the responsibility of monitoring the Affordable Care Act and nonprofit hospitals, and is generally underfunded anyhow. So you're not going to see anybody at the IRS going, oh, gee, we'd like to do more regulation here on this issue. So I think we're talking about sense and sensibility about transparency. The kind of issues that John raises, but even there, they're a little bit limited. If there are lots of John Tylers out there, and I don't know who your new CEO is but, you know, if there were lots of people of that caliber leading philanthropy, we'd be saying, oh, we'd have a great conversation about what these issues really are. The problem is that there are 100,000 foundations. Not all of them are really doing anywhere near the kind of engagement or discussion or revelation that the Kaufman Foundation does. In the Kaufman Foundation, you go on their website, you can see all their theories behind what they're doing. You can see their analysis of what they believe in terms of private enterprise and the role of small business and so forth. Most foundations, you'd have to take a pickaxe at them and try to figure out what they're all about, and you still can't figure it out. Or sometimes you get all this language and rhetoric, and you're not quite sure what it really means. So that we're talking about a number of foundations where we're charging them with the stewardship of these philanthropic assets, but we're not quite sure what they're really doing. We're not quite sure whether they're engaged in many of these issues. They may not even be reading my fabulous columns in Nonprofit Quarterly, so much less the erudite books that John writes. So with that extended preference, let me, and given the composition of the panel and the audience, let me lay out my concerns for increased transparency and the reasons that necessitate more of it and some of the mechanisms that deal with some of the issues that John raised. Let me start with the proposition that for transparency in this nation, the issues of transparency in this nation, when John said government is not all that transparent, everybody nodded their heads, and I've written much of that myself, as you know. You can't divorce foundations from the rest of society. We're part and parcel of what's going on in society. I just returned from the Council on Foundations annual meeting, and where they talked about a vision of philanthropy. They called the Council 2.0. I love that internet language. I never quite understand what 2.0 is or what 1.0 was, but it was predicated on extensive partnerships with business and government, and of course partnerships with nonprofit grantees. And the word partnership was used extensively. And it really made me, as I'm sitting there thinking, and maybe listening, it made me think of John's book, because it made me think about the legally required elements of transparency that emphasize the internal operations of the foundation, whether it's using its resources charitably, whether it's following the rules regarding political intervention and so forth, versus the kinds of transparency that are usually asked of for public charities, which tend to be more public in their orientation, that they're more outward because there's a sense of the focus on accountability and the focus of transparency of public charities to be how they're relating much more to society. But if you have this now orientation of foundations to say we're partners with all these other players, and the partnership is what you're going to look to us for as the future, it does raise an interesting point about the odd fence that foundations have actually put themselves into, or onto, which is how much are they private entities that are looking at their internal accountability regarding their compliance with the law, and how much are they dealing with transparency issues because they are engaging with the outside world as partners in terms of a number of things. Now, I've covered issues of disclosure and transparency as they affect foundations in their relationship with government many times. For example, I wrote about the Social Innovation Fund, which many people here know is a program of the Corporation for National Community Service predicated on a number of foundation roles where foundations are re-grant makers for that program. And I've pointed out from the very beginning that there was a significant problem with the way that corporation operated in terms of transparency, that it actually went backwards rather than forwards on many issues of transparency. And we've been pushing that for quite a while, that in fact, I would say in some cases you might even think that foundations were brought in to reduce the elements of transparency in a public process, and it was very, very disturbing. And the resistance to transparency, even minimum standards of transparency, was quite odd. More recently, you still see it. Many nonprofits, for example, use VISTA or AmeriCorps volunteers. There was a story recently about VISTA workers in West Virginia, and the cuts that VISTA would be incurring in West Virginia. And when the press went to the Corporation for National Service and asked for comments, the spokespersons went in reverse gear and could not be found to talk about what it means, what cuts were coming down and so forth. And to be fair to this administration, that's hardly a new phenomenon. It was the last administration, the administration before that, and so forth. So that government, to me, is not the rationale as to why there's a call for transparency, but it says that if there's if it's a problem in government, We can't move foundations out of that and say, well, foundations somehow are not part of the societal dimensions of what's wrong with transparency in our society. And I think foundations are putting themselves in that public perspective. And as they do so, they are challenging themselves, not because of legal requirements, but because of a sense of proving the worth of what they do in terms of how they relate to society. So my concerns really go to John's really useful listing. It's in the back of his book, and the last part of it is a useful listing of misnomers and fallacies. I would have taken some of your misnomers, by the way, and put them into the fallacy section as well. So it was quite a useful thing. And it's a challenge for philanthropy. It doesn't matter whether it's liberal or conservative, that the issues of transparency are what foundations in some ways have crafted for themselves. When the new CEO of the council in her plenary address repeated the themes that she stated before, she said that institutional philanthropy faces its most critical moment right now. She said that at a time when our world faces a storm of converging challenges with dwindling resources, philanthropy's positive impact remains a mystery to far too many. We must seize the imperative to help society better understand philanthropy's impact and contributions. Obviously, some of that need might have been evident in the testimony at the House Ways and Means Committee on February 14th, when foundations responding to Chairman Camp discussed the future of the charitable deduction and the future of philanthropy as well. And the questions from both sides of the aisle were on the value of foundations, the value of what they contribute. And remember that the foundations that testified, there was a wonderful presentation, a very articulate presentation done for the foundation sector by Kevin Murphy of the Berks Community Foundation. It was brilliantly done, but he touted the service to the poor and the service of foundations for basic needs. And then, of course, when members of the council said to the foundations, well, tell us, how much service are you really doing for the poor? How much are you actually providing for basic needs? And there was a reaction like, well, you can't ask us that. But we'll tell you what we're doing as part of our presentation, but we don't want to actually have that as a requirement or as a measure of what we do. So to some extent, some of these issues that foundations are raising as issues of accountability or transparency are issues that they themselves raise as their defenses for what they do in the first place. The admonition that foundations have to do a better job of telling their story is a frequent refrain, but I don't think that's transparency. That's managed transparency. That's telling the story that foundations want public policymakers to hear, they want the general public to hear, they want their stakeholders to hear. I'm going to get into the stakeholder issues. I think John's analysis is fascinating. But transparency is not managed through public relations firms. It empowers the users, the recipients of the information, to hold agencies of government and well-heeled donors to campaigns and institutions without direct levers of official accountability to the public for at least more engagement, if not real accountability, at least more debate and dialogue over what they're doing and what their role is in society. That doesn't mean simply opening the doors of foundations and inviting people like me in to rifle through their file cabinets, although I'd probably like to do that. But it does mean making more essential information accessible and reviewable by outsiders. And I understand, by the way, that philanthropic assets aren't quite public dollars, although I would guess I think they're probably a lot more public than some of my panel colleagues do. But nonetheless, aggrieved constituents can't knock on the door of the Kaufman Foundation and say, well, I want to have an administrative review of that grant, or I want to vote John Tyler out and vote somebody else in. They can't do that. That's not the issue that's involved. We're talking about dollars that aren't fully private dollars either. The foundations have their feet planted in two worlds, the private world of the donor and the public world of resources afforded a special status by the American public and its representatives, and that's the struggle we're talking about when it comes to this issue of accountability. So let me actually discuss the issue of stakeholders and then go to my recommendations for what I think could be practical solutions for some of these issues of transparency. I think the issue of stakeholders is a significant one. And it's one, again, John and I have been having this conversation before. I think this is an issue that the foundations in some ways have created through their own language, through their own discussions. They're different than just grant recipients, and those effectiveness studies that say, are you happy with your foundation? Aren't you glad you got those grants? That's not quite effectiveness. That says, did they answer my phone? Did they answer the phone call nicely? But that's not really effectiveness. Stakeholders are different than insiders such as donors. They're different than insiders such as board members and staff. They're different than grant recipients. The Denver Foundation, for example, defines stakeholders as people who are impacted by your work as clients, constituents, community partners, and others. The Goddard and Betty Moore Foundation says that grantees, community residents, and external experts are what they call potential stakeholders. At some foundations, John talked about the blended kind of role in the business world where stakeholders are being brought into decision-making. In some foundations, that's occurring too. There are some foundations that are bringing in community people to actually participate in the grant-making roles of those foundations. I believe the Gates Foundation actually has done some of that in some of its grant-making as well. Some of the health conversion foundations have done that. John provides a very useful distinction between rights holders and interest holders in the discussion of stakeholders. But there's no question that foundations are talking about an elevated involvement of interest holders in their work. The common parlance of the foundation world is that stakeholders with a vested interest in the foundation's world merit inclusion in efforts to assess the foundation's impact and to address how it's relating to specific communities. While it's a common concept, the circle for how that gets defined is very hard to figure out. Foundations, I think, have to come to grips with what this language is. It's one thing to say we value stakeholders, but on the other thing we say we don't want these interest holders really to have much of a role. This is one of those issues where foundations often get caught by their linguistic petard and they don't know which way to go. If you ask me then, what public purposes or what societal purposes might be served if the foundation sector were to adopt improved disclosure standards? And again, I point out they have to be voluntary because I see no interest in legislative or regulatory changes in this score. And I would suggest these as the following purposes and following strategies that address sort of a meta purpose for foundation transparency, not specific narrow things, but hopefully broader purposes. Go back to telling a better story. The glossy annual foundation reports that foundations issue, the cost of writing, design, printing that exceeds the budgets of most of the nonprofits that I work with, are not particularly persuasive as telling a good story. I get, as somebody who writes for a living, I get press releases from foundations by the boatloads every day, touting this or that of what they're doing, and usually they're from high-price PR firms, although the foundations I barely have heard of, so I'm wondering how are these non-existent or very small foundations paying these huge amounts of money for press releases and press PR firms? I wonder how they have so much time to focus on sending this stuff out and printing this stuff out. Why not just have your nonprofits tell their own story? I mean, that's the best story that's out there, is nonprofits telling what they do. If philanthropy has a strong story to tell, it should be one that can be told not by issuing information through an eyedropper, but by making information available generally, engaging in the public debate, and so that the sector can learn, debate, and assess what foundations do. And that requires thinking of foundation dollars not as public or private, but as institutionally part of the nation's social contract, which was a debate that I had at the Council on Foundations, and meriting not that they're responsive to government, but they're responsive to society and their role in society in terms of improving societies. Maybe it takes us back to our Talmudic discussions as well. Second purpose, fostering civic engagement. Now, foundations are pretty unified, regardless of their political leanings, in favor of increased civic engagement. In fact, I believe that's part and parcel of what the social contract is. I mean, hopefully the social contract is to make us all better citizens, so we're better engaged in what goes on in our society. Foundations can make a sectoral commitment to more foundation information available in order to make citizens and policymakers better consumers of foundation products, just as foundations want to help citizens be better consumers and participants in the processes of government and business. And this doesn't mean I'm not talking about turning everybody into an advocate. This is not an argument for nonprofits basically supporting advocacy. This is an argument for building civic engagement, strengthening civil society. And I think that underlies, when I read the Cohen Foundation materials, some people might say, well, gee, that's all about business stuff and privatization or this and that. I see it as building a civil society, a concept of civil society, and that requires increase transparency in order to have that kind of dialogue about what civil society is, and you really want that to happen. The third element, which is increasing legitimacy in public policy role. As I noted, increasingly foundations are moving into the public policy arena, not just through their own grant making, but through their direct participation as partners and allies and so forth. They partner with government at various levels. The recent spate of foundation engagements with government are not just the Social Innovation Fund, but you can find it in the Race to the Top at the Department of Education. And also you find it at a number of lower levels. In Detroit, where I spend a great deal of time, foundations are engaged in a major way because of the fact that the government there is so dysfunctional and the needs are so huge. You have several foundations that are developing and running programs that in some ways are taking the place of what government does, by virtue of the fact that government just isn't even performing in those areas. As foundations move beyond supporting nonprofits to becoming direct players in the public arena, that requires them to enhance their transparency. That doesn't mean government does a great job of its own transparency. That's not my argument. I would actually ask for government to be much more transparent, not fully transparent. I agree there are limitations, but there's much more the government should be doing. But at the same time, when foundations become partners with government, and those partnerships are multiple and very complex, and even the Cohen Foundation, I believe, has government partnerships and engages in, that those issues become issues to think about foundations doing more, finding more ways of increasing the transparency of their operations, their grant making, their values. Now, let me go to another one, which is the issue of increasing accountability itself. Now, I haven't read the President's new budget yet. I'm sure I'm going to get to it probably in the next couple of minutes. But I believe it calls for digitized financial reporting for some nonprofits or all nonprofits. I believe there's something in there about digitized reporting that so you could look at a 990 and rather than having to weigh these telephone book documents and not be able to read them or use the data, you can actually get into them and play with the data. Better, expanded, standardized data makes oversight easier. It's that simple. So much of the data reported in 990s is not standardized, and when it comes to some aspects of it, such as foundation investments, it's actually virtually uninterpretable. When the IRS expanded the the Form 990, I wanted to ask them, how do you think that's going for you guys? You think this has been a real improvement in life or not? I mean, let's find out, let's get useful information in there, but get it so that you can actually interpret it. The fact that the 990 and the data that's presented is often so uninterpretable is not a reason to drop the data requirement. It's a call for improving the reporting, improving the formatting of the data so that entities, public entities, oversight agencies, and people like me can figure out what it actually contains. One would hope that a move toward making reports more interpretable and more accessible leads to a cleaner approach to how the data is actually presented. To provide the public with stuff that nobody can make heads or tails out of doesn't do anybody any good, and of course causes time for both the recipients and for the foundations. And do you want to know where people are putting their money? I think it's very important. I've looked at some foundations, and I found foundations putting their money into overseas places where they're trying to avoid certain kinds of reporting and so forth. And you say, shouldn't we know about where that money is going? You bet we should, because that's a public purpose in life. So I think that's worthy of discussion. And then finally, my final point is mitigating the abuse of 501c3 confidentiality. The nation faces an explosion of these organizations and money that are seeking C3 confidentiality for the purposes primarily of keeping the identities of people, the players who are pulling the levers of the political system secret. One television commentator, a guy named Dylan Radigan, says that our political system has become an auction in which the highest bidder wins, but the identities are increasingly kept under wraps. In other places, I was a public sector official for many years in lovely Jersey City, New Jersey, and I can tell you that many public sector entities are creating C3 arms, and you can see this, by the way, in public universities as well, mainly to basically take some parts of their operations outside of the realm of public disclosure. And I saw that, I watched that, I was aware of it, I knew what people were saying to me as to why these entities were created, and I thought that was pretty awful to think about creating C3s for the purpose of removing a slice of their operations from public scrutiny and oversight. If this nation's going to pursue greater freedom of information, it's going to have better mechanisms to follow some of that money. And we need to make sure we follow that and don't allow the C3 structure to become an arm for reducing transparency. So let me just conclude to say that what I love about John's writing, and again, it's great stuff, is that he goes beyond, he's a great lawyer. I'm a law school dropout, by the way, so you should realize that I have that limitation here in this analysis. But he goes beyond what the law says. He's talking about the underlying motivations and reasons for why things are done or not done, and what the pragmatic issues are behind them. And I think there's a pragmatism in his writing that shows the tension between the public, or shall we say, societal role of foundations and the specific legal regimes that are required of foundations. There are people who operate in this world thinking fallaciously, I believe, that there's always a clean, clear, and automatic answer, that, it's either this or it's that. It's more transparency or less transparency. It's this legal requirement or that legal requirement. What I love about John's writings is you don't find that clear answer. You find issues for debate. What's that? I should have stayed in law school. But it's great to think that the advancement of philanthropy is one where it's not simply a matter of simple answers, but it's a matter of a debate, a societal debate, that talks about the successes and failures of foundations, talks about the societal role of foundations, and the impact that foundations have in our world. And I think if we have transparency that achieves more of that, that makes foundations stronger, not weaker. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Rick. Heather Higgins is president and director of the Randolph Foundation in New York City. She's a board member of Philanthropy Roundtable, a co-founder of Alliance for Charitable Reform, president and CEO of Independent Women's Voice, chairman of Independent Women's Forum, and is also involved with Hoover and UBS. She's been a portfolio manager and an editorial writer at the Wall Street Journal. She continues to write and offer frequent commentary on radio and television, and I'm delighted we'll be able to hear her commentary now. Heather.
Thanks, John. Mrs. Felix Frankfurter used to say, when talking about her husband, the justice's speeches, that they had two great failings. The first was that he departed from his text, and the second was that he returned to it. And the good news I have for you is that I have no particular text. I have been taking notes, and I will try to be brief because I assume that you, like I, are hungry for lunch. I think that I am here in the, I should be wearing a cloak. I'm here to defend opacity, which I am happy to do. I gave a speech for the Philanthropy Roundtable, actually had a debate with Michael Joyce, I think it is now 20 years ago, where I argued that the move by the Rockefellers in 1913 to purchase the New York State legislature when they couldn't get Congress to grant the idea of perpetuity for foundations, because prior to that, all common law had understood that perpetuity was a really singularly bad idea, was going to lead to problems. And we were, in historical terms, only a very short way along the trajectory of what was going to happen over time if these institutions went on in perpetuity. And one of which was we are all human beings, and the large and growing pot of money would provide an irresistible temptation that few would have the intestinal fortitude to resist. And so there would be increasing claims that this was public money and that we all needed to have our fingers in these pies of what had heretofore been understood to be private entities with the rights and privileges that went with that. I want to go first to the misuse, as I see it, of the word stakeholders, because the parallel is drawn between government and businesses and now foundations, because they claim through, I will describe it as the hubris, a lot of their individuals who run foundations want to feel that what they're doing is important. That's very understandable. But they have abrogated to themselves certain language and positions which I think are not appropriate and is now getting them in trouble, and they don't quite know how to get out of it. And one of the challenges here is that the word stakeholders is not why we have transparency in business or government or churches. You have transparency because you have ownership interests. And the people who are owners, who own stock, or who pay taxes, or who contribute at the offering plate for the church, have a vested interest in knowing how their money is being spent and having clarity about what is being done with those things. In the case of foundations, there is an endowment that was given by some individual or some collection of individuals. There is no public donation of funds of any kind to these institutions, and therefore there is no ownership interest and claim, therefore, for the need to know or the right to know other than prurient interest, of which we all as human beings have a great deal. The second word that I have a problem with is transparency. We've broadened it to mean just about anything. If you're looking at the transparency that a company has with its stakeholders, it's not transparency. In fact, it isn't even transparency with its shareholders, because we're not getting the secrets to how to make Coca-Cola or their marketing strategy or anything like that. What it is clarity of communication about those things that are relevant to those particular individuals. So if foundations find it valuable, if they're doing, for example, inner city education, to go spend a lot of time in those communities talking to those parents and those educators about what works and what doesn't and what's needed and what isn't being done, that's fantastic, but that's not transparency. That is a valuable conversation about needs, means, and ends. Different animal. There's a lot of use of high-minded words that sound really good, and who of us is going to be against transparency any more than we're against sustainability, right? It's you know, with the co-option of words that get so reduced that they don't actually mean something. So it's useful when we actually have a chance to see these words in application. And in this particular instance, and Rick is a very thoughtful man, and if I were he and I were in his position, I'm sure that I would be making many of the same arguments that he makes, and they are made with high-minded purpose. But there are real serious risks of abuse here, because understand, I am very much in the, let not your left hand know what your right hand is doing. I read Magnificent Obsession when I was 14 years old, and I decided that was the way to go with anything good that you did in your life. Maimonides said it as well when you were citing that. But there are real reasons for foundations to be more opaque about what they give, not just the practical business of salving the feelings of all those grantees who come to you and don't get funded, about the real reasons that you're not funding them, which is, can be varied and sometimes personally hurtful to them. But more importantly, I'm a big believer in having whatever we have to do to have the most vibrant and innovative and risk-taking and problem-addressing, efficacious philanthropic entity out there. And it is my view that forced transparency, as we have seen it promulgated, would be contrary to that. You would get safer grants. You would get more politically correct grants. You already have got the problem with foundations not wanting to risk failure, which means not trying new things, not starting new organizations, not helping people who are untested. It's not a science, it's an art, and there's a lot of trial and error, and that's part of the reason what makes the sector so successful when it is successful is precisely the fact that there are wildly different senses of what needs to be done and the ways in which one wants to go about approaching them, and that these things get tried. And there's a huge amount of redundancy and there's a huge amount of failure, but it's still a whole lot better than the government doing it if you look at the results that are actually achieved. And so I wanted to go into 2 examples of where we've seen what transparency can mean to people who are activists. Because let's be frank, the general public does not give a hoot about this. The stakeholders that are concerned are the would-be grantees and the policy activists and potentially the politicians. So let's start with something that the National Center for Responsive Philanthropy came out with a few years ago called Criteria for Philanthropy at its Best. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? But you read it and you have a whiskey tango foxtrot moment. You go, oh my God, this is voyeurism on spade as a prelude to a shakedown. In it, they specifically say, and I quote, "The purpose of this work is to criticize those who don't measure up and policymakers may find criteria valuable when considering regulations or legislation, and the media will find the resource helpful for reporting. They have 3 criteria that I think all of us in this room would think sound good. Good values, effectiveness, and ethics. Is it ethical? Well, let us look at the Orwellian redefinition of these terms. Good values in this is that you give 50% of your grants to lower income individuals or to those who are part of the designated ethnic or marginalized groups. And when there's another piece of legislation I'll talk about in a minute, AB 624, which you referenced in California, there are, I believe, under the census, something like 147 different racial groups, but only 7, the ones that happen to have active political organization, are the ones that qualify for this. Even where you have a foundation whose dedicated purpose is something that has nothing to do with lower income or racial groups, say, for example, you are dedicated to the environmental preservation of the oceans, sea otters be damned. Your mission has to give 20% of your dollars to what the NCRP thinks is worthwhile philanthropy. That's their idea of good values, their idea of effectiveness. It has nothing to do with accomplishments. It has nothing to do with whether the grants you made were actually effective and actually move the needle in any way. No, here it is that 50% of the grants have no requirements attached, and 50% of the grants are multi-year. So this is basically the wet dream of the recipient community, but it has very little to do with actual effectiveness. Then ethics. What do they mean by ethics? Well, many of us who believe in philanthropic freedom would probably put at the top of that list adherence to donor intent. Certainly the Ford family might view this as an ethical consideration. But no, it is about demonstrating accountability and transparency to the public, grantees, and constituency. And part of the way they do this is they measure your board structure and management. So what does that mean? What does having a good board look like? Well, it means that there have to be at least 5 people, and that those 5 people, they hate all family boards. Just so you're clear, families are a bad thing. It has to include people who are diverse and not affiliated with the family, and who are lower socioeconomic income, at least one person who is lower income. Board members can't be uncompensated except for the lower income person, which is an interesting thing if you think about it, because how are they planning on knowing who's the lower income person on your board? Now, if you are a foundation that doesn't agree with this or is risk averse, or doesn't agree with this and doesn't want to strip naked for everybody, you are risk averse and suspect, and your ethics are now questionable. So basically, this is a setup for newspaper articles to say foundations are found to be deficient in their ethics. Foundations are not following most effective practices. And then we get to legislation like things like AB 624 in California. Now, there's no reason that anybody who's not in the foundation world should have paid any attention to this piece of legislation, which nearly passed. But it's very important because it's the camel's nose under the tent. And what this piece of legislation required was that for every board, for their staff, for their management, that you were going to, in its initial drafting, disclose the race, the sex, the gender, and the sexual orientation of all of those categories of people, and you would have to do it for every one of your grantees. Would you like to go to the Heritage Board and ask them what their sexual orientations are? Just throwing it out there. I think there's certain privacy concerns that might be violated by this, but this is part of transparency. And you couldn't just do it on an aggregate basis for your grantees. No, they needed to be listed organization by organization. This is called data building. This is called the opportunity for knowing where you're going to go next in terms of creating political pressure. It also required that, much like NCRP, that the 50% of your grants had to go to, surprise, greenlining was behind this bill. Greenlining is a social activist organization. 50% of your grants had to go to groups that were social activists. So if you were Catholic Charities and you were actually doing a fantastic job of educating inner city kids, that didn't count because you weren't majority minority controlled and majority minority board. It didn't matter what you actually did. It's who controls you. It's what you look like. So understand that when we get into broad and general words like transparency, somebody gets to define them. If you start from a Lockean, or I would call the founder's understanding of this country, which is that we have individual rights, and the purposes of law is to not limit us in those, and to not abolish or to restrain, but to preserve and enlarge our freedoms. This is effectively a move in the opposite direction of that. But if you are a Wilsonian and you believe that the public, through its greater scientific knowledge, ought to be able to democratically decide to go wherever it wants and do whatever it wants and find out whatever it wants and has a right to know whatever it wants to know, then you're going to like transparency. But the rest of us will find that the charitable sector suffers for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. We have time for a few questions. Is the microphone?
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. For some of the voluntary transparency, could things be done more over the internet with having the meetings over the internet and people expressing how they're pointing the effort and what's involved?
I want to probably take issue with one part of what I understand the premise of your question. That is, I'm not convinced that meetings should be open to the public at all, much less open, through the web or through the internet. Whether that's board meetings or internal management meetings or grant decision meetings. But there's another side of it. Can foundations have meetings with the public and engage with communities that they affect and do learn and distribute, disseminate using the web? Absolutely. I think it's a great tool for that. I think that there are advantages to personal interaction that the web doesn't necessarily allow for. So I want to carve out part of the definition of meaning or of meeting, but suggest that the web offers a great opportunity for distribution, for dissemination, and for engagement, provided that's what's in the interest of the foundation and it achieving its charitable purposes.
Can I make one little modification on that? And that is that I worry about the identity when it comes back on the social media. I spend a lot of time on social media, and partly you want to get information out through social media, but also you look into social media for input back, and technically you really don't know who's talking to you. When people talk to you through their Twitter accounts or whatever, there's a lot of stuff that if you're relying on this as a supplement, for getting things out, but if you're relying on this as a way of finding what your stakeholders,
At least say
have
interest holders.
interest holders have to say, my hard lesson that I've learned myself is you have to be cautious as to what the identity of that person is and whether or not that identity is really quite what you think it is.
Which is a great point, because it's so interesting to me that in social media, it's so easy to not be the least bit transparent or the least bit open in a medium that purports to promote openness. And frankly, as foundations are receiving information through this media, the source matters, and knowing the source matters, and just because it comes into the foundation doesn't mean it's valuable.
John, are you telling us that you have a female handle that you use when you go online?
I'm not going to say anything.
Good answer.
Back here's one. Oh, over here, okay.
Hello. Are there any surveys or more formal studies that may examine the potential relationship between increasing restrictions or standards or shaming on foundations and the number of foundations created or funded or the amount contributed? And does the panel think that's a valuable question?
I don't know of any studies like that.
No, I know of a number of small foundations that are turning into donor-advised funds, which is a sort of a
Yeah, that
movement
becomes-
because it's both cheaper and easy, actually, very easy, and you reduce your administrative costs as a foundation. And plus, by the way, there is less disclosure through that because donor-advised funds don't have the same public regime that a foundation does, but I don't think I've seen any studies to that effect.
There also are some large foundations who occasionally give to donor-advised funds to give other grants, and one would assume that this is involved in that.
That's correct.
For what it's worth, for example, we've used donor-advised funds. Now, this is not so much public shaming, but we're supporting groups that have fatwas against them when we're doing anti-terrorism work. And so, I don't want to put our trustees at any kind of risk. So it's very useful to have something like that. But I think you've also seen on issues that are socially divisive or whatever, that people just, they want to be able to quietly do what they believe, but they don't want to get grief for it. So.
Hi, Diane Silber. As a donor, I think there are donors involved in philanthropy, contrary to what Heather Higgins said. I know foundations that are family-funded aren't. I believe they get tax write-offs when that whole foundation is formed, though. In addition, it seems to me transparency is critical for donors, not only to know how money is spent and what proportion, but to make an evaluation of which charities are worthy of receiving monies. Places like GuideStar and others do that to some degree. I'm just interested in knowing if this is not under what you've been talking about, or if so, your opinions on this.
I may not be understanding your question. If you understood me to say that I didn't think that receiving organizations shouldn't be clear about their financials and their management, that would not be correct. Again, we go back to that ownership interest. If you're asking me for some money, I expect you to be really clear about how that money's being spent and what you're doing with it and what your effectiveness rates are, et cetera. We're just talking about you as a donor. I don't expect you to tell me everything that you're doing as a donor or why you're doing it or what your financials are.
No, but as people contributing to
Yes.
philanthropic organizations, I think we have a right to know.
There's a very useful distinction here between a private foundation and a public charity. Even though they are both called 501c3 organizations, one receives money from a lot of different individuals and sources, and they should have a very different standard of transparency and accountability than the organizations that are giving to them, which are not asking anybody for any money. They are funding all these different organizations.
So presumably not the sexual orientation of our board.
Well, and in part, the reason for the different standards is practical. Because public charities are raising money from the public, then that means they're looking to broad sources for their support. And so they need to be broad in their explanations and in their reach and what they make available to be able to attract the funds into the organization. The foundation, given that it is private foundations have, as Heather said, limited contributors and sometimes only one contributor, so they don't have the same practical reasons to be more open.
But there is an interesting question that I think is also part of what you're asking. When you cited GuideStar, sometimes the question becomes, what are we looking for as the information in transparency? And sometimes we've boiled this down to mechanics or equations or ratios that actually tell us very little about the real work of either foundations or the groups that they support. So that hopefully, when donors are looking for more information, or when charities looking for more information to their donors, they're asking better questions than just what's your financial ratio between administrative expenses and so forth? How much you're spending on fundraising? Asking questions about what are you really doing, what motivates you, what are the substantive issues behind your charity? And I think that we've had a slight problem in our sector in foundations, and I'll say the foundations are some of the cause of this. We've gone into a measurement mode where everything has to be done in terms of quantitative measures, and we're losing what I think is the essence of really what is a lot of good philanthropy. So hopefully, keep asking those questions and looking for the sources, but ask good questions too.
Yes.
Scott Walter of Capital Research Center and Philanthropy Daily. I enjoyed Heather and Rick's talks a great deal, and I wanted to put Rick slightly on the spot because I've long enjoyed your writings, which are very interesting. And if my memory is correct, there have been times when you have been willing to endorse more mandatory requirements, such as the ones that Heather criticized in her talk. Is my memory wrong, or have you evolved?
No, I thought, well, I think Heather knows that I probably don't work for NCRP.
Not anymore. No.
But.
And that report came after you had
After,
departed.
That's right. I think the interesting part of it, I mean, the criteria is something separate. Let's go to the AB 624 issue, which is always the big concern. And what I thought was particularly funny about AB 624 is, by the way, the issue of sexual orientation was sort of added as an extra part of that. It wasn't in the original bill. I very rarely have any kind of discussions where we talk about wet dreams or stripping naked and so forth. So this is a very unusual panel for me. So if I get a little nervous, please. But I thought what was so odd about that, and why I found the foundation's objection so untenable, is that everything that was asked in the original bill, before they got into, I thought, things that unless you're going to do DNA tests was going to be hard to figure out, was that those are exactly what those foundations ask for of almost every other entity. That those foundations are asking of, in fact, I actually looked at those foundations' stances on what they ask of the board composition of the Public Utilities Commission in California, what they ask of the board composition of the banks that get funded. They're asking all the same issues, and I thought, wait a minute, how can you as philanthropists say that you can ask this of everybody else, and you even ask this of many of your grantees, whether it's mandatory or not, many of those foundations certainly do. But when the question gets turned around and is applied to you, it's like, oh, no, somehow we are different. We can ask the question, but we don't have to respond to it. So I felt that if there is a legitimate public purpose in understanding who is directing philanthropy, and it was only applied, by the way, to the, 15 or so largest foundations in California, it struck me as a very minimal issue of reporting, not mandating that they make grants in certain directions. And I know that was one of the fears, that this was going to be like a slippery slope into turning into minority grant making. But it was a useful quid pro quo. If you're going to ask, then you might as well respond yourself. And if you can't respond yourself, then don't ask.
Heather, are you itching to say something?
Yeah, I'm hoping that they took that lesson to heart. I mean, one of the things that was, I think, very clever about that piece of legislation is that those 10 foundations, for the most part, had slipped into a casual use of language and practice, which then turned around and bit them because they had not thought these things through clearly. They didn't understand, for example, that there are two very different definitions of diversity. The first definition, which most of the country would think is an extraordinarily good thing, is having a diversity of players, of outcomes, of viewpoints, sort of like restaurants or art galleries. We have a whole plethora of them, which as a universe creates this wonderful mosaic. But there's this other version of diversity, which is that everybody has to have a little bit of everything within their organization. And in fact, the proposals for governance structures were extraordinarily unworkable. If you want to have a workable governance structure in an organization, you better have everybody having a similar idea about endpoint and philosophy. And if somebody's wildly opposed to that, all you're going to wind up with is the mediocrity common ground that is at least not controversial. Much better to have two separate organizations funding very different things than one trying to accommodate both and doing neither. And so they had not thought through issues like diversity, issues like transparency, issues that what were really important to ask about, and they were being hoisted on their own petard.
Thank you once again to Philanthropy Roundtable for putting this together. Thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking this wonderful and thought-provoking panel.